between appreciating the delight of the Scottish fans but not wanting to see the ground pulled apart like this. They've even knocked the goals down and broken the crossbar.
We'll beat them. We'll beat them. That's it, we'll beat them. I mean, it all goes back to Bannockburn. It goes back to history and all that sort of thing. And it's not a hatred in any way whatsoever. You just want to beat them.
We don't consider ourselves underdog, but you feel as though England have controlled your country politically for many, many years. And I think that's the undercurrent of it all, really, where it all started when you were a young guy.
Because for these people, beating England is more important in many ways than doing well in the World Cup.
Nothing in the history of football has ever matched the crazy passion the Scots show for the game. Wrapped in tartan and spurred on by gallons of whiskey and beer, they relive a past of gallant resistance to a bigger and stronger foe. For more than a century, there was only one enemy worth challenging on a football field: England. To defeat the old enemy on its own territory at Wembley was more than a moment of passing pleasure. It was an ambition instilled in childhood for Scots fans and players alike. In 1977, it had been 10 years since they had been victorious here. In their unshakable belief that they would do it this time, they had packed the old terraces of Wembley and turned the fixture into an away game for the English team.
Everything between Scotland and England is intimidation. You've got to be ready for any type of intimidation. Going up the tunnel, Big Gordon McQueen sort of looks over to me and he says, "Millsy, can you smell the whiskey?" And I just could feel myself just smelling the air. And I thought, God, I can smell it. I could literally smell the whiskey.
I dread to think what it was like for an England player when it's a home game, you're in London and you're walking out, with a goal down right away.
And he looked over at me again and he says, "Millsy," he said, "can you spot the Englishman?" And I'm looking round the stadium and all I could see was Scotsmen.
Scotland are playing from right to left in the white shorts. Hartford again.
It was the game of the season. The game you wanted to be picked for was the England-Scotland match, whether it be at Wembley or whether it be at Hampden.
Masson took it. Jordan!
The big game for the Scottish nation, Scottish supporters, it was the Scotland-England game. That is without a doubt. You know, it was one of the major games on the calendar.
Never forget it. Worked in that set piece all week, just aiming for the biggest thing in the park. My head.
There was one abiding memory that I have. Second half, we're packed in like sardines behind the goals. Suddenly, this guy appears on my right-hand side. Now he's got his carry out and he's drunk it all, and he is struggling. His bladder is just full to capacity. So he turns and says to me, he says, "Where's the toilet, big man?" So I look behind me, it's the sea of Scottish fans. I says, "You've got no chance, pal." He said, "Oh God, what am I going to do?" I says, "That's your last can, just piss in the can."
It went on to Dalglish. Dalglish again, and it's there.
Next time, Kenny Dalglish scores. Go! Covered in it. And it must have been the only time I've ever went in a packed tube train that I've got a seat to myself.
And we're in injury time, and there isn't much of that. It's all over.
The game was over, but the legend was about to unfold.
The people going on the pitch, it just seemed natural. It wasn't like everybody made a decision to rip the place up. It was, I think, a thing to get to see the players and to pat their backs, etc. And once they were in the field, I mean, people were gouging away with keys, gouging away with Latin beer cans, gouging away with their heels, taking bits of turf. It wasn't like they were destroying the pitch.
And I just stood there for a while. I didn't run right on, I just stood there and savoured the atmosphere. So I eventually went to the part of the park where I recalled that Gordon McQueen began his run from to score Scotland's goal. And by that time, quite a lot of the turf had been dug up, and it was quite easy just to get your hand underneath and lift up a sizeable divot, just enough to fit inside my tammy. But my head needed a bit of a wash after I got out.
One of the most amazing things was that when we got down the tunnel, there were Scottish fans in the dressing room at the time, and there was also some in the bath. I think they should have taken some of their clothes off before. They were all in there, fully dressed.
Just thankfully none of them got into the English dressing room. They were quite welcoming ours. We were pretty happy anyway, so it didn't make any difference. There was another couple of Scottish fans in the dressing room or in the bath.
I was just about to retire then, and I had a pub in Islington called the Sutton Arms. And they came into my pub and slapped great big masses of Wembley turf. Look at that, Frank, they were saying, great big slabs of turf. And my pub was covered in Wembley turf, it was.
77's assumed a kind of mythical status. Regularly you hear of somebody who has the turf in their back garden or has a fragment of the post, and it's rather like fragments of the true cross used to go around medieval Christendom, and people would touch these relics and in a way be blessed by them.
The first international, played in 1872, may have been a friendly encounter, but by the time this remarkable film was shot of the match at Newcastle in 1907, it had become a fiercely competitive annual fixture between the top professionals of two deadly rivals. Though the English had originally taken the game north of the border, very quickly the Scots had become masters, their players much sought after by English clubs. This game was a one-all draw, but for the first 30 years of the internationals, the Scots reigned supreme over their one-time lords and masters. By the 20s, the internationals had become a showcase for the sale of Scots talent. While this side, fielded at Hampden in 1925, nearly all played for Scottish clubs, the following year, many stars like Hughie Gallagher had been sold south of the border to English clubs. In fact, Scotland produced an astonishing number of top-class footballers, and their migration south of the border underpinned the entire English game.
Scouts regularly worked Scotland as a coal seam would be worked. They knew that they could get good nuggets up here. That money really kept a lot of clubs alive.
McFadden kicks off.
In this 1938 Cup final between Preston North End and Huddersfield, over half the players on the field were foreigners. No, not Italians, Norwegians, or even Dutchmen, but everyone a Scotsman.
Preston start the second period, quite a feature of which is some mighty throwing in by Shankly, Preston's right half.
In fact, Preston North End, the winners by a single goal in extra time, were virtually all tartan.
Preston were always well known, of course, really, as a Scotch side, really, because I can remember, I think it was the cup-winning side in '38 had about 7 or 8 Scotch people in it.
The referee's decision was a penalty. Much takes it. The ball hits the bar and goes in.
Scotland must have been practically deserted on the day of the Soccer International at Wembley. From the London stations...
The migration of Scots players to England was followed every 2 years by the tartan army of fans who from the 1920s had made Wembley their mecca. Their invasion was greeted with amusement by London-based cinema newsreels.
Never before has London known such a large-scale invasion of Scotsmen. No wonder they called out the troops.
Scots have been going across the border to the international game in large numbers since at least the late Victorian period, so since the 1890s.
40,000 visiting tartans had to find a place in those broad acres dedicated to football. And
the movement to Wembley was institutionalised by the 1920s and 30s, so the tartan army were there very early on in football's history.
This was more than just an away game for the Scots. It was a holiday they saved up for through local savings groups called Wembley clubs.
You can find Wembley clubs based on any kind of organisation, ex-servicemen's clubs, workplaces, Masonic halls, churches, chapels, streets, you name it, there's a Wembley club. They were very important then. Certainly from the 20s and 30s, people are saving up for this biennial trip to Wembley.
Oh yeah, in Scotland they did that all the time. They just put in maybe 2 shillings a week. I can't remember the exact amount of money.
And then after 2 years, they'd have their train fare, the ticket, you know, if they could get a ticket, their booze money, and wherever they were going to kip for the weekend.
To get a Scotland and England ticket was like something magical. You know, people used to stare at it. They would bring it out in the pub, look, I've got a Scotland and England ticket, and there would be about 20 people would come up and have a look at it. They'd all be over the shoulders, oh, you lucky bugger and all that, you know. It was something else, it really was.
In the First World War, the internationals had been abandoned, but between 1939 and 1945, there were more England-Scotland games played than in peacetime. The teams were given leave from the forces and changed from uniforms into their national jerseys to play before massive crowds. 15 internationals were played in the 6 years of the war.
The first time I ever went to Wembley, the first international match I ever saw in my life, was I stood behind the goal watching England play Scotland. This was during the war and I was in the RAF.
England won 11 of these games, but the results were not counted. They were friendlies, played to raise war funds and boost morale. In 1950, 5 years after the end of the war, Scotland and England agreed for the first time to take part in a World Cup tournament.
If you think there wasn't a crowd at Hampden for the match against England, I can only say there wasn't much room for any more to pack
The
in.
packed terraces of Hampden Park cheered on a Scottish side fighting the old enemy for the British Championships.
England, white shirts and black shorts, as you see, were first on the field. They were followed by Scotland.
Having beaten Wales and Northern Ireland, both sides had already qualified for the World Cup finals in Brazil. But for the Scottish FA, beating England was more important than taking on the rest of the world.
Miraculous saves that fairly thrilled the crowd.
We beat Ireland and Wales, but unfortunately England beat us at Hampden 1950, I think it was. They beat us 1-0. So although Scotland could have gone, they decided they would only go if they won.
No score, and England on the rampage again. Then a pass from Langton gives Bentley his chance, and it's 1-0 for England.
It does show how arrogant we were, that we disdained the World Cup merely because we had not beaten England.
As it turned out, the Scots' arrogance was probably a blessing in disguise. British football in the stifling heat of Rio became a laughingstock. They beat Chile before taking on the rank outsiders, the amateur USA team.
And of course they won the game 1-0, and it was probably the most embarrassing moment I've had in international football, to lose against really a non-footballing nation.
Uruguay in light shirts meet Scotland at St Jacobs Stadium in Bow.
4 years later, in the World Cup in Switzerland, the Scots were put in their place by the reigning world champions Uruguay, who tore them apart.
Miguez, with no one to mark him, bangs it home. Half-time, and it's still 2-0.
The great thing about it was you were meeting the best of other countries in the World Cup. And you were meeting players that you haven't even heard of before.
Borges dashes in from the wing, and there's number 3. It looks too easy the way they do it.
All of a sudden, you saw them, things like chesting the ball down, which you never saw in England at that particular time, and killing the ball on the thigh, and passing the ball with the outside of the foot.
Uruguay are soon leading by 6-0. And can you wonder at it when they can play football like this? On he goes to put the ball into the wide-open net. 7-0, a score that Scotland won't forget for a long...
We were looking at them, starry-eyed at them. You know, when you saw all this happen, you started to, of course, practice it yourself. But they were doing it at kids at 4 and 5 years of age. We were starting to do it at 22 and 23.
Despite these setbacks, Scots boys were still being brought up to believe that the only team worth beating was England. Few families had television. They knew little about World Cup football.
All the Scottish wee schoolboys, I think, have got the one team you want to beat is England. Nowadays it's Brazil and Germany, but in these days the only team you wanted to beat was England. They were the enemy sort of style.
It was always Scotland, England. Always, and the poor goalkeeper was always England, you know. Everybody attacked the goalkeeper. the footballers were Scotland and the goalie was England.
They dreamed of beating England, but not of footballing riches.
North of the border, the vintage match of the year. Scotland on the left versus England. 130,000 saw England kick off. Here at Hampden Park, Scotland haven't beaten their old enemies for 27 years.
For up-and-coming young players, even in the early 1960s, football was a glamorous game, but by today's standards, very badly paid.
Scotland soon got over that shock. A mistake by England's new centre-half.
In fact, many young Scots internationals were part-timers. In this 1960 match at Hampden, there was a rising young Scots star who was still an apprentice in a steelworks, Ian St John of Motherwell.
Now, we play against England at Hampden Park, the biggie. All our life we wanted to play in. And you get there and you're playing 134,000 people there. You know, really, the noise, the Hampden roar was really something special.
Not long after the resumption, Charlton was tackled from behind by Duncan Mackay. And to general Scottish dismay, the Hungarian referee awarded England a penalty. Charlton himself took it. England were level.
And it was 1-1, and I got clear, and I'm running, being chased by the England defenders, and the roar of the crowd, and I race up, and I'm trying to think what I'm going to do. Now, I wanted the goalkeeper to do something. I wanted him to react so that I would react. And he didn't do anything. He just sort of come a couple of yards off his line and stood, and I ran it right up, almost on top of him, and then knocked it with the outside of my foot, which I could do 99 times out of 100, and knock it in the net, and it just rolled past the post. But then on Monday morning, I had to go in the steelworks again, you know, and you can imagine them. You clock on and you're walking through there, and guys had been at the game, and all obviously betting, you know, betting in Scotland to win, and well, the abuse I got.
When I was first picked to play, even for Scotland, I was a painter to trade. I was still serving my apprenticeship. So it was a case of working during the week, training on a Tuesday and Thursday night. I was a part-time footballer, and then playing on the Saturday. I was a house painter when I played against England.
Wembley was at its best as England and Scotland took the field. For the first time, the Queen, accompanied by the Duke, was there to see a match between these ancient rivals. Jimmy Greaves gave a perfect pass to Robson, and he scored. At £100,000 worth of footballer, Jimmy Greaves scored goal 2.
Scotland had always offered limited possibilities for top-class players compared with the bigger, richer English league. So their international stars moved south. But they soon found when they did that their loyalty to Scotland was questioned. They were labelled Anglos.
Johnny McLeod sent the ball to outside left, Davy Wilson, and it was Scotland's second goal. And England's fifth goal came from Bobby Smith. 5-2, Pat Quinn scored their third. Haynes scored from the edge of the box. Oh, it's terrible.
Only two of the Scots side in this humiliating defeat in 1961 were Anglos. The hapless goalkeeper, Frank Haffey, was a true Scot from Celtic.
Seconds after Haynes' last goal, Greaves scored again.
Haffey let in 9 goals, and the mostly tartan team suffered their worst ever defeat by England. But those Scots who had moved to the English League knew who would get the blame.
A sad day. Johnny Haynes received the British International Championship trophy from the Queen. A proud day for...
If there was a defeat, all the Anglo-Scots got the blame of it. They used to call us traitors. They felt if you were a home Scot, you deserved to get your place before the Anglo-Scot, and you were just everybody. I mean, we used to have a laugh at it.
You would open up the paper like that and you were scared to look at it, because there, guaranteed, was the photographs of myself and Dennis Law and Ian St John and whoever else was there at the time. And our photographs were like, you felt like terrorists, you know. And the pressure that I personally felt on that, I think, stopped me from having more caps. I didn't play as well for Scotland in Scotland as I think I might have done. I might be making excuses, but I really did feel, instead of it being a wonderful occasion for me, It was an awful lot of pressure to do well.
Jerry's gone now, Willie. Good ball.
In reality, the Scots brought to English clubs a fiery patriotism which managers exploited in training.
We used to have a lot of fun in England at club level, especially when it was coming up towards, you know, the Scotland-England games, and training would have, right, let's have the international, let's have the Scotland-England. I mean, these games, they'd be worth the entrance money, the five-a-sides, everybody getting stuck in.
But every Friday morning at Arsenal, we had an indoor gym of red ash. And we used to, no matter what the game was the next day, we had Scotland versus England. And we had it for a half an hour, and we used to kick lumps out of each other.
From the four quarters of the earth they came, pilgrims united in devotion to the world's greatest sport.
I welcome all our visitors and feel sure that we shall be seeing some fine football.
When the World Cup was staged in England in 1966, the age-old rivalry with the Scots revealed deep antagonisms. Beaten by Italy in the qualifying rounds, the Scots could only watch as the old enemy took on the rest of the world at Wembley.
Jimmy Greaves, wondering no doubt if he was in match-winning form. Gordon Banks. Bobby Charlton.
That much-celebrated final against West Germany in '66 was, for many north of the border, a match not to savour, but to forget.
In 1966, I had a pub, and I let the boys stay in to see the final of the World Cup, and I was absolutely devastated, truthfully devastated, that most of these supporters were supporting Germany against England, and I was so angry, I was nearly shutting the shop and putting them out.
Thousands of German supporters salute their team.
I wanted Germany to win. Well, there was any question about that. We wanted Germany to win. If you weren't from England, you all wanted Germany to win.
I know there's a lot of Scots didn't want England to win it for the old reasons, you know, the rivalry and whatever, but not me. I wanted them to win it.
A toss-up which couldn't be got.
Not so the majority of Scots fans glued to the TV in 1966.
Well, you have to appreciate the big housing estate. You were schooled in the anti-English feeling, so there's only one team you could support, and that was the Germans.
The 1966 World Cup final.
Everybody's really egging on the Germans to score, and they did.
Who was the better? Haller, a goal! West Germany have scored!
Fantastic. The whole estate you could hear. Whoa, big roar, brilliant. Everybody's on a high. Next thing, terrible. England equalise. Silence.
With a free kick. England! It's an equaliser! Hurst. What a chance! A goal!
Terrible.
Peters!
England going in the lead in the second half. Pressure. Oh, hope the Germans could get a last-minute goal.
Now will the Germans snatch a dramatic equaliser and bring us to extra time? It's Emmerich coming in. And he's... Oh, yes, it must do! They have done! Weber has scored in the last second!
Well, you know the rest of the story for there. Unfortunately, 2 disputed goals. England won it. Nightmare.
This is a great success.
I'm in Edinburgh when the film Goal, the official film of the World Cup, comes out. And every time England appear on the screen in one of their matches, they were booed and jeered and hissed. I think that shows what the Scots thought of England's victory. And of course, that made the Scottish victory in the England-Scotland match at Wembley in 1967 all the more sweet.
More England supporters believed Scotland had a chance. How wrong they were destined to be. But as the Scots set the ball rolling, it seemed a foregone conclusion that England would triumph again.
How sweet it was. Out of the World Cup in 1966, the Scots proclaimed themselves world champions in 1967.
Dennis Law scored for Scotland.
Everywhere I go in the world and every Scotsman I meet in my life remembers one day, one game, Of all the games, I must have played 25 times against Scotland. I remember the one game in 1967.
At half-time, England was still 1 goal behind, and with Jackie Charlton limping from a broken toe, the champions were up against it. But surely they couldn't lose, not on this classic turf where they whipped the world's best last summer. For most of the second half, Scotland's attacks were parried. Gordon Banks was in great form. Bremner had the ball. He passed to Law, to Lennox, and it was the Scots' second goal. Five minutes left. A pass found the gallant Jackie Charlton. England had scored at last. All hopes of an equaliser were shattered by Jim McCalliach.
The desolation in our dressing room afterwards, we just couldn't come to terms with the fact that we'd been beaten at home just after the World Cup, and especially by Scotland, and everything that went with it. Every football club in the land with a Scotsman in it, you know, you knew you had to go back and you knew you were going to get plenty of stick. I was at Everton at the time, and we had a fanatical Scotsman there, Jimmy Gabriel, and we'd had bets and bets over if England beat Scotland. I had to name what he had to eat, and I used to take the tripe in, you see, and he hated that. And then we got beat, and obviously I had to go and had to eat the cold Scottish porridge with nothing in it, just the real horrible stuff. But he came in with a great big bowl for me, did Jimmy, and he sat, and all the lads and I had to go and eat it in front of everybody.
The invasion by the Tartan horde over the sacred turf of Wembley.
The Scots fans' antics at Wembley worried few people in 1967.
It was their holidays. They'd saved up for 2 years, and I'm sure some of them are still here. Haven't got back yet. You know, even from those games, have stayed in England and got married and whatever. And that was just it. That was their life, to come down and see Scotland beat England. It would be nice if they'd bring a bit of the ground back, because I think they took it home that day.
They came on the pitch and they got bits of the turf. So what? I mean, nobody worried. It was a celebration, and everyone was happy about that. But 10 years later, when they did the same thing, everybody got on the high horse and said, "This is disgraceful, you know."
After 1967, the Tartan Army, more confident and younger than ever, carried on the tradition of the Wembley clubs.
71, we went down what you could easily describe as a cattle train.
These days there was no banning drink, so it was like people getting on with the equivalent luggage you take for a month in Australia or something.
Everybody was drunk, everybody. It was the only way to get through the journey.
It was like people sitting in the toilet, people sitting in the corridors, people in between carriages. It was just drinking.
We stopped at places like Carlisle and Stafford, and you could just see the look on the porters' faces when they saw this train coming in. They thought, my God, what is this? It's like something another world. People were out the carriage being sick.
Next thing you know, you're at Euston Station. And Euston Station's absolutely full of people all over. Some people maybe spent 2 days there. And it's like a refugee camp. If you didn't go to Wembley, you were nothing. At that time, the home championships were more important than the World Cup.
In the mid-70s, tolerance of the Tartan invasion began to wane. Scots fans had to make their own way to Wembley in 1975 when London bus and tube workers went on strike after the maiming of a railway worker by drunken revellers 2 years earlier. This did not deter the Scots from their crazy quest to make it to the International, whether they had a ticket or not. By 1977, the Scots fans who packed Wembley and tore up the pitch were branded as thugs, the unacceptable face of British football.
By 1977, we've had the best part of a decade of so-called football hooliganism. It's viewed as another example of football as a slum sport, as the Sunday Times said, watched by slum crowds in slum stadiums. It's an example of that. That's how the media locate it.
From 61 right up to the last game, which is a Wednesday night, I didn't miss a Wembley outing. And to me, the 1977 debacle, that was the kind of beginning of the end of the annual trip, the Wembley clubs, the sojourn down to Wembley.
The outrage in London at the 77 pitch invasion seemed to be forgotten the following year. If Wembley had been packed with Scots, Hampden, as always, was almost pure tartan in 1978, and the old enemy fixture had all its old vigour.
They're shouting, they're throwing things, they're giving you the flash of the, you know, what they've not got underneath the kilts. They give you a good flash, and it's then that it hits you. You realise what the fixture means to them. Howls of abuse as you walk from the bus to the entrance of the stadium. And then from that moment onwards, it becomes a very, very lonely experience. Away in Scotland, without an Englishman in sight, you know, it's tough. It's really tough.
No matter where we went on tour, if we went on tour and we played Brazil or we played Germany, who were the great sides at the time, Argentina or whoever you played, it was the game of the season. Now, personally, I'd rather have played at Hampden because you were playing in front of, say, 120,000 people and 118,993 of them were jocks. Now, to go up there and beat Scotland and stick one right up them, that was absolutely magnificent.
Oh, and rough under pressure, Copper was there!
Nobody would have guessed in 1978 that just 11 years later this fixture would be abandoned. By the 1980s, both nations were increasingly preoccupied with qualifying for world and European competitions, and the old enemy matches were becoming a major headache. After the chaos of 77, the Scots were no longer welcome in London. In 1983, the game was moved to midweek in a deliberate attempt to discourage the Tartan army.
I don't know what the English FA are trying to do at all. I think they're trying to stop the fixture. They're against the Scots, whether we come down here or not. They seem to be against us. I think it's us that are going to cause the trouble.
They're not letting us come down here at the normal, traditional Wembley weekend, which is played on a Saturday.
We don't treat the English the way they treat us. All the pubs are closed. Can't get a drink.
Authorities try to stop it, they move it to midweek, they ban it. Though the game goes on being played after that, I think from then on it's in a spirit of bad will, of ill feeling, if you can put it like that.
And in '85, the match was switched from Wembley to Hampden to minimise any trouble. But while English fans had not traditionally travelled north, this time an army of hooligans descended on Glasgow.
This is what the football authorities wanted to avoid at all costs.
When English supporters or English spectators began to turn up in Scotland, they very often were attached to bodies like the National Front. There was aggro.
Strathclyde police had been tipped off that hundreds of English supporters were heading for Scotland for the sole purpose of causing trouble.
It became obvious to the Scottish Football Association that it might be better not to be playing England because they didn't want to be painted with the same brush.
The last Old Enemy International was played at Hampden in 1989. Violence on the terraces had hastened its end. But it was a match which, for all its historic importance, seemed to have outlived its time.
10 minutes remaining. Ball, and again! Oh!
I think that's one fixture that still should never have been scrubbed. That should have been played all the time. I mean, it's a great fixture. The fans love it.
They're just very special games, purely and simply because of the feeling the Scots had towards the English.
I'm, for one, glad that it's not continuing. We don't need it. We don't need them, quite frankly.
The Tartan army, once content to spend a weekend in London every 2 years, was by the late 1980s globe-trotting as Scotland competed in European and World Cup competitions. Outside Britain, the Scots were welcomed as they once had been at Wembley. In Sweden, for the European Championships in 1992, they were voted best supporters.
I love to go and see Scotland anywhere, especially abroad. Sweden '92 was probably the highlight of the Tartan Army's career. I I didn't realise how much pull a kilt could have until I reached Sweden.
When in 1996 the Tartan Army returned to London for a European Championship game against England at Wembley, there was a whiff of nostalgia for the Wembley club days. But it could not be the same. Scots fans no longer dominated the crowd. Scots players were fast disappearing from English football, and indeed some England players were even earning their living in Scotland.
It brought back good memories, really, but times had changed everything. In the 70s, obviously, the best players in Scotland came to England, but in 1996, the second goal was scored by an English guy who played his football in Scotland, and it must have been a strange thing for the Scots to endure, to see somebody who they grow to love, and then on that particular day...
Scottish Player of the Year. A Tartan English player scoring against Scotland at Wembley. It appeared to reverse more than 100 years of footballing history, and was proof enough that if the old enemy fixture were ever revived, it could never be the same again.